HB 3225 by Alders relating to the prohibition of access by minors to sexually explicit materials in municipal public library collections, providing a civil penalty.
The chair recognizes Mr. Alders to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this is a simple bill intended to protect our Texas kids. This bill addresses a real issue that we have seen in our public libraries across the state, and it does so in a way that is reasonable as well as effective. It's not a complicated bill. It shouldn't be controversial. HB 3225 simply requires municipal public libraries to move books with sexually explicit material out of the sections for minors and into the section for adults. We do have an amendment.
Mrs. Weiner, for what purpose?
The gentleman yield for questions.
Will the gentleman yield for questions?
I can. Some of the questions may be better asked after the amendment, but I'm happy to
The gentleman
answer
yields.
any.
Yeah. Thank you, Representative Alders, and would certainly be happy to visit on the full bill at the end. But I think I want to ask some questions about things that I don't think are going to be addressed in the amendment. And I think some of the main area we have some disagreement on is the question of teenagers and what teenagers should have access to. And so as I read your bill correct, this is going to restrict the ability of teenagers to be able to check out many books in the library. Is that correct?
Restrict is a little bit beyond what I would say. What I'm trying to do is ensure that material is placed where appropriate, and we're giving parents the opportunity to play a role in their kids growing up and accessing content that would be deemed inappropriate by most of us for children, for minors. And so giving parents that opportunity to enable their kids when appropriate to have access to that is the goal of this legislation.
Okay. So functionally, this legislation would mean that, well, let me go back from functionally and say, on its face, what your legislation would do is say that all minors, regardless of how old they are, cannot check out books with sexually explicit material as it's defined unless they have permission of their parents. Is that correct?
Yes, parent, legal guardian, that is correct.
Okay. And that prohibition and those definitions are consistent regardless of whether we're talking about a 5-year-old or a 17-year-old, correct?
That would be correct, yes. I would assume that as children are growing up and teenagers have the opportunity to interface in a more mature manner with certain content out there in the world, that's very likely that they'll have that access. I mean, when you're applying for a library card, you can get that taken care of pretty easily and have that access granted. I want parents to be able to have that opportunity to help direct and protect their kids when appropriate, and then give them those opportunities as well when it's appropriate.
So libraries usually have thousands of titles, potentially tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of titles,
Absolutely.
correct?
Correct.
One of the things that concerns me is that with the way this bill is structured is that libraries may functionally just have to deny access to anything out of the minor section to teenagers. Are you concerned about that?
We've worked, so that's one of the areas where I believe the amendment will be helpful because we have interacted with Texas Library Association and TSLAC to ensure that this bill is written in a way that libraries can be successful, that they can operate within the goals of the stated goals of this legislation and actually be able to protect our kids and move the books that are needed to be moved in an efficient manner, and then protect those and curate those collections appropriately moving forward. And so the amendment addresses some of the timeline, what we mean by access, so that the definitions are clear, the expectations are clear.
Okay. And I want to be really clear. I really appreciate the work you've done with Texas Library Association to make sure this bill doesn't fundamentally undermine library operations. So I earnestly really appreciate that. I think my concerns are we have teenagers who get pregnant. Would a pregnant teenager be able to check out a book on pregnancy from the adult section without their parents' permission?
I don't believe that pregnancy is going to be covered under the definition of sexual conduct that I have in this bill.
Okay.
So that should not be an issue.
Okay. What about a novel that's maybe speaking to their experience of another teenager who has become pregnant, and perhaps that moment of becoming pregnant is included in that book. Would that teenager, again, who has clearly already had that experience because they're pregnant, would they be able to check out that book without their parents' consent?
They would need, they'd need a guardian or parental permission to be able to access this. If it has been moved to the adult section and the content of the book falls under the definition of sexual conduct, then yes, that would be necessary.
Now, being a minor does not stop somebody from having adult experiences. 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds all make choices wisely or not.
Correct.
And a lot of young adult literature attempts to speak to those experiences many teenagers may have and help them connect there. Are you concerned about teenagers not having access to books that are relevant to them and the lives they're living?
Well, it's a good question. I don't think that obviously minors have a lot of interactions prior to that ideally occurring in their life, and it can be good or bad. I think we all know that they have access to a lot of material online, and when there's a need to understand what's going on, that's a separate conversation. Our conversation in this legislation in 3225 is addressing collections in our public libraries that are accessible by every member of the public, and children need to be protected from sexually explicit material, and our children being confronted with that when they are not, when they have not been in that position in the past. And so I think the important thing to know about this legislation is, one, it's focused on public libraries that are accessed by all members of the public, our children, our families, and we need to protect the kids who it's not helpful for them to have this as their first experience with this kind of content.
So, Representative Alders, you keep using kids, and I do want to be clear, a lot of what I'm trying to ask about is teens.
Correct.
Are you aware that the U.S. Supreme Court has found that minors do have a First Amendment right to access of information?
Sure.
And are you aware that the U.S. Supreme Court has found that when looking at material that can be restricted from minors, despite their First Amendment rights, that you have to draw that line differently depending on the age of the minor?
I would again point to the definition that we have in this book. This is not a question of access to information. This is an access to sexually explicit content. And we define that very clearly, and it's a definition that you can read from the back mic, but it's material that we do not want our children to have. I don't want my children to have. I don't think it's beneficial for them. And so I think it's important that we protect our kids in the state of Texas and ensure that they can access the books in their public library for their benefit, for their good, and are not confronted unknowingly with material that is going to potentially traumatize them for the rest of their life.
Are you familiar with the Miller test?
Right.
Are you familiar
Ask
with
that
the
again.
three-pronged Miller test?
No.
So the three-pronged Miller test is a constitutional standard for obscenity, and it requires that to be considered obscene. Material must be, 1, appeal to a prurient interest, 2, must be patently offensive, and 3, contain no other value. When we look at that for minors, we apply all those tests to minors. Does your bill use that type of three-pronged definition?
I think if you look at the definition that we have on page 2, that it would fall in line with what you're talking about there.
The piece I'm concerned about is that last piece of having no other artistic or literary or other value for minors. We have books, I'll use a very commonly challenged one, The Bluest Eye by Nobel Prize winning author Toni Morrison. That book is 230 pages long. There are 5 pages on it that have any type of sexual content that might be considered explicit. Under your bill, provided those 5 pages, I'll concede may fall under this definition, provided there's a book with 5 pages that fall under this definition, would minors, including older teens, be prevented from checking that book out without parental permission?
Without parental permission, no, they shouldn't. And as you said, those 5 pages contain descriptions that fall within my definition. And I mean, it's the same thing with media. You don't have an X-rated movie because the entire movie contains explicit scenes. You don't have an R-rated movie because the entire film contains non-stop R-rated activity. It's based on small portions of content within the greater scope. And I think that's what we're looking at here, is that if you have text within a book that describes graphically according to the definition that we have in this bill, then it needs to be moved to the adult section of the library. We need to protect our kids. We need to protect their vulnerabilities and acknowledge that that kind of content is bad for them. It's not good for them to interact with without someone coming alongside and explaining. And you and I have had good conversations about this over the last few days. It's not to say all of this is never appropriate for them to interact with, and there's opportunities for someone to talk through something that is important in their lives where you've had a traumatic incident and they need to figure out how to communicate. But that is not what we're talking about here in this legislation. And having someone who comes alongside and helps a child understand how to deal with a traumatic situation in their life, that's a separate issue. And you need those books. These books need to be in the adult section of the library, and you need guidance on how to deal with the issues that we've talked about.
I think you and I have slightly different perspectives on the traumatic side of this, but I want to come back. I really am grateful that you brought up the movie rating system. Are you aware that that system is entirely voluntary by the industry and doesn't have the force of law because of First Amendment concerns?
It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist for a good purpose to protect the viewers that are out there. And maybe we need to change that. So.
And speaking of the movie rating system again, does the movie rating system just draw one hard line for minors and non-minors, or does it have different graduated levels for different age groups?
It does, but take the issue, if we're talking about X-rated movies, you have to be 18 or older, at least you used to be 18 or older, to be able to go to the theater and watch an X-rated film, right? And so we're talking about X-rated material being in the adult section of the library. I don't think there's much of a difference there, if any.
I think many of us would dispute that the books that would be covered by this definition would be the equivalent of an X-rated movie. I
would beg to differ on that.
I think the concern is that some of these books feel PG-13 to us, or R, and quite
I would submit
appropriate
that
for some
is
of those.
because we have become numb to some of this material in our culture today. And for better or worse, we're inundated with content around us that has allowed us to become numb over the years. And so just because it feels PG-13 doesn't mean that it is that. But we've allowed our standards to drop in a way that is unhelpful, and it allows us then to look at something that would never have been appropriate for our children 20, 30, 40 years ago, and gone, well, that's probably okay. They're probably going to run into it anyway out there in the world. I think that's a dangerous place for us to be.
Well, I appreciate that perspective, and I will be frank, I share some of your concerns about sort of over-sexualization of culture and what young people can be exposed to. I think where we differ is whether or not books are part of that problem. So when somebody engages with fiction, a book is asking them to step into the shoes of somebody that's going through something and experiencing something. And again, that might involve a sexual situation. It might involve a teen making decisions around that. And do you not think that people being asked to engage fully with a sexual situation, with the emotional consequences, with the real life consequences, is actually an antidote to some of this hypersexualized little instances, divorced from all context, divorced from all sense of real life?
I don't think that that is the proper way to handle a situation like that, for one. And for two, we're protecting kids whether they've gone through that kind of a situation like you're referring to, and those who haven't. And I think we need to remember that, most kids hopefully are not having to go through those kinds of hard times, and they need a piece of literature to help them understand what they went through. What about all the kids who have not, and who are innocently going through the shelves of their minor section of the library, and they pull off one of these books innocently and they flip through it and they're confronted with this, and that's their first interaction? I think we need to take that into consideration, and that's what this legislation is intended to do.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I want to back up a little. I think I wasn't clear on exactly what I was trying to talk about. Let's say a music video. I don't listen to any new music, so I don't have any current examples. But let's say a music video that is, we would all agree, raunchy and very sexualized, very objectifying. Do you not see the opportunity to engage with the same type of content with the emotion and consequences and real life implications that are involved in a piece of fiction as being an antidote to those one-off sort of sensationalized visual performances that are viewable so easily everywhere?
I think this would be one of those instances where we would just have to agree to disagree.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for answering my questions, Representative Alders.
Thank you.
Will the gentleman yield for questions, or do we need an extension of
Will
time?
the gentleman yield for questions?
I will.
Gentleman yields.
I got confused. Are we talking about fiction in the library, or are we talking about all books in the library?
We're talking about any books that contain sexually explicit content in the minor section of the library.
And per your definition, minor means under the age of 18.
That is correct.
So we're not talking about kids under 5. We're not talking about kids under 12. Minor is anybody from birth to the age of 18 per your definition.
That is correct,
You
Representative Johnson.
have created definitions of sexual conduct, correct?
That is correct.
What is Section D, sexual bestiality, mean?
Do you want to describe that for me?
Yeah, I know. I would actually like you are the bill author. You have put this in. What does sexual bestiality mean?
I know. But, I mean, to put it clearly, if you want me to describe sexual relations with an animal, that's what that references. So,
I'm sorry, I got interrupted. What does sexual bestiality mean?
that would refer to sexual relations with an animal.
Okay, what about sadomasochistic abuse? Wait a minute. Look, everybody's now saying we have kids on the floor.
We do.
All right, well, how do we honestly have a discussion about something that you want to put into definition and you want to impose on a public library? So let's just have this point. You have put
Ms.
these-
Johnson.
Hold on, Representative Alders. Masturbation. Do we know what that is?
We do. Ms. Johnson, I would suggest that you're proving my point.
Say it again, I'm sorry.
I would suggest you're proving my point.
No.
There are children on this floor, and there are children in the gallery, and children can watch this, and you want to put it out in front of them on the record. That's fine.
You put this on the floor, not me.
I am
you put this on the
suggesting
floor.
all of.
And you're suggesting the ignorance around a topic without having a legitimate public policy debate. And I would
I'm
suggest to
suggesting
you,
ignorance on the topic.
yeah, are you really suggesting that a book that explains to a teenage boy who's lost his father what masturbation means shouldn't be in a public library?
Did you read the bill?
I did.
It does not say anywhere that it shouldn't be in a public library. It says it shouldn't belong in the minors section.
And your definition of minor is under the age of 18.
That is correct. That's the legal definition of a minor. You can take that up with the federal government, I guess, but I don't. It's not. This bill is not addressing that.
Doesn't a public library have different sections of the library?
It absolutely does.
But you're not only redefining what they can do, but you're imposing a civil penalty on every public library. You're not differentiating between pornography or something inappropriate. You have included in this definition of some which you don't like the words I read that you brought to this body in public with something that is basic teenage health.
This is not basic teenage health, Ms.
Masturbation
Johnson.
is not basic teenage health. Do you really, as a young man,
No,
want to
I do
describe
not.
to me when you needed to learn about that?
Please ask the question again.
Yeah. I'm trying to separate out the flag waving.
Gentleman's time has expired.
May we have an extension of time?
Members, you've heard the motion. There is objection. Vote aye, vote no on the extension of time. Members, I'll give you time to get to your desk. The clerk will ring the bell.
I'm fine.
Division vote, I'm sorry. Strike the board. The gentleman's time is extended.
So, Representative Alders, my concern is, again, I didn't bring this legislation. You brought this legislation. You're attempting to not only impose civil penalties on public libraries, you're not only attempting to put more power in the Attorney General's office to enforce that, but you have created a definition, in my mind, that doesn't really intend to accomplish your goal. Because if your goal is to keep sexually explicit or deviant type of conduct of which you say you could never imagine appropriate for discussion. And I don't know how old you are, 20 or 30 years ago, but I would bet at some point you as a young man needed to have the discussion with somebody about what masturbation meant because your body at a young teenage age made you have to try to figure that out.
That wasn't a question I expected on the House floor.
Well, don't bring this kind of stuff to the House floor to warrant this
Ms.
kind
Johnson,
of debate, and you
Ms.
won't have
Johnson.
to answer these questions as the bill author.
Ms. Johnson,
The chair will admonish the members not to speak over each other.
I brought this legislation to the House floor to protect our kids. You are questioning me bringing this legislation to the House
I'm
floor.
questioning the manner in which you are conflating sexually explicit or dangerous conduct with basic health information for puberty, which hits people in their early teenage years. You're conflating the two. That's my
It
concern.
sounds like a great opportunity for a parent to give access to their child, to
What do you
get
do when
a
a
book
kid?
off the shelf in the adult section and work through that education with their child when appropriate.
When did you get a puberty lesson in school? At what age? And were you provided?
I would like
a
us
book?
to stay on the bill, Ms. Johnson.
This is about the bill.
This is not about the bill. This is
You're
about.
talking about education.
I would suggest that this is about your desire to ensure our children have access to sexually explicit material
Really?
in our public libraries.
Representative Alders, do you know what I have done for a living?
Yes,
What have I done for a living?
defend kids.
Do you know that I'm the former chief human trafficking prosecutor in Harris County? Do you know I'm one of the only people in this room that has actually gone to bat for this population in trying to make sure that kids are protected from sexually explicit conduct and abuse?
Ms. Johnson, I would suggest that this bill will help you.
Representative Alders, you should know your audience. I care very much about good public policy and protecting kids from sexual exploitation.
Good.
What you are doing is attempting just to get a nice campaign moment with everybody sitting there to suggest that I'm asking for something different, And I'm telling you, defining something under the age of 18, defining a term of which is a normal puberty condition that any teenage child may need to have information, if we as a nation can't allow a public library to have basic health, I'm not talking about these other definitions of which you didn't want to define and you weren't prepared to talk about in this public setting. I'm talking about basic puberty and public health that is trapped up in your extremely broad attempt to get your moment at the mic.
Mr. Dutton, for what purpose?
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
Gentleman yield for questions.
Absolutely.
Gentleman yields.
Let me ask you, because I had a bill to do this, and I understand the point at which you're trying to make, but wouldn't it make more sense to have a restricted section in the library that a child could only access with parental permission?
Mr. Dutton, that's a great question, and it's really what this does. We had a conversation with our local library where we had this issue arise about creating a section of the library specifically for this kind of material.
A restricted section.
And it restricted, yes.
Yes.
The challenge is it puts it all in one place, and it becomes a bit of a magnet for people who are looking specifically for that kind of material. And that's not what the library is intended to do.
Well,
and so changing it, making sure that we're calling this material what it is, which is adult, and saying we need to make sure that if it falls under the definition of sexual conduct as specified in this bill, we need to move those books from minor sections to the adult section. And I believe that's an incredibly reasonable and rational way to handle that issue.
Well,
and it's great to hear you've offered a bill in the past.
The librarians I've spoken to said that they could very well manage a section in the library that would restrict it, that would only have access, that would only allow access if the parents approved of the children to have the access. And they said to me, I said, well, can you do, they said, yes, we can do that. We do that all the time.
Right.
And certain libraries. Now, I just wondered if what we're trying to accomplish is that children won't have access to certain books except with their parents' permission. That seems to be the best way to do it.
And I would argue that's what this is doing.
Well, it's
Representative
doing a
Dutton.
little bit more than that because it's trying to provide civil penalties and criminal penalties. That means you got to prove all this and go to court and do it.
Well, that's a great question, and I'll answer it and I'll add to it. The purpose of the penalty is to ensure that libraries follow through on this. We didn't want to make it restrictive and difficult for a library to accomplish the goal of this legislation, which is why, by the way, we still need to bring up the amendment. We worked with TLA following our hearing on this to get their feedback and ensure that they gave us guidelines of how they could accomplish the goal of our legislation, and we implemented that into what we're trying to accomplish in the amendment so that they can make sure we've got the time, we've got the ability to move these books to the adult section of the library. And so the goal of the civil penalty is for it to never have to be used. But
Well,
if you're worried about it, if you're worried about a particular book, move it to the adult section.
Yeah, well, I'm more worried about the fact that we would criminalize conduct to try to achieve an end when that might better be achieved, the same end being met through a lesser means. We ought not to be criminalizing conduct if we can change the behavior by doing it another way. And that's what my problem is, because what you'll find is that even if you have this, I think, you have the criminal conduct in there,
Right.
how's it gonna work? Who's gonna prove it? I mean, who's gonna go to court And what lawyer is going to handle this particular case on a civil side? Because what are the damages?
On whether or not a violation has occurred,
Yes.
the Attorney General's office is authorized to pursue it if the library does not comply with the law within the time permitted.
Well, and there's one attorney general in how many libraries?
We have 300 and change municipal libraries around the state.
Well, that just seems, almost insurmountable for one attorney general's office, unless you're going to have now a section in the attorney general's office that does nothing but prosecute these. And I'm just trying to get you to focus on another method by which you could achieve the same objective.
Well, and I appreciate the question. It's interesting, in our discussion with TLA and TSLAC, they never gave us any heartburn over the $10,000. It was more of how long do we need to make sure that we follow through on the guidance. And so I think the goal of the penalty is to ensure compliance, and that's what we are seeking to do here.
And I understand their reluctance, but at the same time, I want you to understand that they could say that because they know that's never going to happen. Never. I mean, there are cases we're trying to get the Attorney General to do now, and that just hadn't happened. And when it comes to library books, I think that'll go down on the Attorney General's list of things to do, as if he runs out of everything else to do, then he might try that. But I would hope you would consider my alternative is just create a restricted section in the library that requires parental approval so that those books will go in there.
The gentleman's time has expired. The following amendment, the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment by Alders.
The chair recognizes Mr. Alders to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this amendment tightens the language of the bill to clarify the limits on access and age verification, as well as adding in a mechanism for parental consent and revising the review requirements. These changes, as I have iterated to all of you, come from our staff working with the Texas Library Association to make the bill practical for libraries to implement. We're trying to make our libraries safe for families and for our children, not create a confusing or cumbersome process. This amendment accomplishes that purpose, and I move adoption.
Mr. Speaker,
Mrs. Weiner, for what purpose?
will the gentleman yield for a couple questions?
Will the gentleman yield for questions?
Sure.
The gentleman yields.
Thank you so much, Representative Alders. I just want to ask about one particular change in this amendment that you and I have discussed so we can get that on the record. Subdivision 2 of your amendment adds this language in an explicit manner to the end of your definition of sexually explicit material. Can you talk about the goal of that change?
Yes, and I appreciate Representative Weiner, our conversation on this, because in the language of the bill, we're talking about sexually explicit material and content that is abrasive. And we're not talking about weird inferences, very gentle inferences about conduct occurring. We are talking about sexually explicit conduct in an explicit manner. And so I appreciate the conversation we've had on that, because that is what the goal of this legislation is for, not an allusion to something happening.
Okay.
We're talking about material that needs to be moved to the adult section.
So the intent of this language is that the intent of this language is not to catch books where perhaps we can tell that some type of sexual conduct has occurred in the screen on the page, but to catch just material where it is occurring in a clearly graphic way. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
Move adoption.
Mr. Anchia, for what purpose?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the gentleman yield for some questions?
Will the gentleman
I will
yield for
yield.
questions? Gentleman yields.
Thank you, Representative Alders. We had the extreme good fortune of hearing this bill in State Affairs, did we not?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. And as we were discussing it, you and I think, we're working to find common ground on accommodations that made sense. And I just want to say thank you for working with the Library Association. I've always been in favor of parental permission. You know, I never much liked being in the book banning business. I always thought there were lesser and less intrusive ways to deal with this issue. And I think you're trying to strike the right balance by making sure there's a minor section. The one part that I wrestle with here is the civil penalty. Does your floor amendment deal with the civil penalty at all?
It does not. And that's, as I referenced to Representative Dutton, that has never come up as an issue for the libraries. They want to ensure that they're able to implement the guidance that we are providing in this legislation. And so my goal is not to penalize the library. My goal is to incentivize them to do the right thing, to protect our kids, to ensure that their collections are curated appropriately for minors to access. And so that's what we focused on.
Do you ever worry that, for example, in a particular community, for whatever reason, the civil penalty could be weaponized for political reasons against the library? I mean, these library issues and what books are in what places of the library, they generate some hot sports opinions. Wouldn't you agree?
I would agree with that. I would argue that our definition is very clear on the content that we're discussing, that we are ensuring is up for debate and needs to be moved. And so that definition is clear for that purpose, to ensure there's not a lot of gray area.
And I've got friends and neighbors who are librarians. Did the association that you worked with ultimately support this piece of legislation with the amendment? I just don't know the answer to that. It's a sincere question.
I appreciate the question. I think they are content with doing the will of the legislature and following the law. And so we're bringing it forward. They were not opposed to the legislation.
They weren't for it, weren't opposed. They were neutral, let's say,
You
to
can remind
use the
me,
language.
Yeah, I think they were on the bill in committee, and we continue to work with them to make sure that the implementation process was possible.
Gotcha. Thanks for answering my questions.
Thank you. Move adopted.
Mr. Alders sends up an amendment. The amendment is acceptable to the author. A record vote has been requested. The clerk will ring the bell. Show Ms. Isaac, voting aye. Show Mr. Louderback, voting aye. Show Mr. Alders, voting aye. Show Mr. King, voting aye. Show Ms. Morales-Shaw, voting aye. Show Mr. Leach, voting aye. Have all voted. There being 141 ayes, 0 nays, the amendment is adopted. The following amendment, the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment by Zwiener.
The chair recognizes Mrs. Weiner to explain the amendment.
Mr. Speaker, members, this is a very simple amendment. It simply changes the restrictions in Representative Alders' bill to just apply to minors under the age of 13. We all know that a 5-year-old and a 17-year-old are very different. And I think much of the language in Representative Alders' bill makes sense as long as we're just applying it to younger kids. Teenagers have a different experience. They need access to different information. Being minors does not prevent them from potentially ending up in a sexual situation. And as Representative Alders and I were discussing on the microphone earlier, I believe that it is actually incredibly valuable for our young people to have the opportunity to enter the lives and experiences of others to figure out how they feel about some of these things. So reading a book about another 16-year-old who is making a decision about whether or not to have sex helps that minor who's reading that book make a good decision. And our biggest worry, members, shouldn't be that a minor will make that decision or won't make that decision. Our biggest worry should be that a minor will have never thought about it and freeze and end up doing something that they wish they didn't. And so them having the opportunity to engage and think about those things is good. The other thing I want to bring up, members, is that a lot of the books that will get covered in a bill like this are books that are part of the AP curriculum. This definition could include books like Oedipus Rex, Candide by Voltaire, most of Shakespeare. This could include books like Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert, Tess of D'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy, As I Lay Dying by William Faulkner, Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston, Lord of the Flies by William Golding, Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. Members, these are mostly books that are classics that many of us have read and enjoyed, and many of us read and enjoyed as minors.
Mr. Speaker,
Ms. Hinojosa, for what purpose?
will the gentlewoman yield for
Will the
questions?
lady yield for questions?
I will.
The lady yields.
Representative Sweener, I appreciate your amendment. We have in our own Austin Public Library a section for older kids, and it is one where my 13-year-old was always eager to get into. So my understanding is you have different rules for different ages, kind of like movies are rated PG-13 for kids of a certain age. Is that what you're doing here with this amendment?
What this amendment does is take Representative Alders' bill and just apply it to minors under 13.
Right.
So minors who are older minors, teenagers only, would be able to check out books without some of these restrictions.
One of my concerns with the bill is that when I think about my own experience as a teenager, and the books that I was interested in reading were often those Judy Blume type, God, It's Me, Margaret, these relationship type books where you're reading about the struggles of other young girls and their relationship issues at that age. And so it does concern me that the language for sexually explicit is so broad for teenagers. Is that why part of why your amendment addresses this?
It concerns me too. And teenagers are curious about sex. That is normal. And I think the question we need to ask ourselves is, are books really a part of the problem, or are they part of something that helps teenagers engage in a healthy manner? I would rather have our teenagers read a Judy Blume book like you're talking about than have them go on Reddit and ask a question and see what the internet has to offer them back.
And are there other areas in school curriculum and instruction where age is taken into account when reviewing content?
Absolutely. We see age taken into account frequently, notably when we look at health curriculum. That already gets divided between elementary, middle, and high school to try and address the needs of the different age group. While my amendment is simply applying the bill to younger students or younger kids, I think us thinking about this in a more structured, age-graduated way would make a lot of sense.
And so what could limiting resources do for these older teenagers like the bill currently does?
Yeah. Older teenagers already have adult concerns like working, taking care of family members, even their own children. And in this type of situation, those children would not be able to access resources or find stories that they can identify with it. A pregnant teenager would not be able to check out books that have one page out of a 300-page book with a sex scene. That feels pretty ridiculous. That is a teen who is about to become a mother. And if anybody needs stories about the consequences of sex, I would think that would be a pregnant teenager.
And I would hope that books that are, and my experience with the libraries is already, the books are divided up into, these are the books for the teenagers and these are the books for the kids. And librarians know how to divide these books up. In the Latino community, I will say this has come up in the Public Education Committee. There can sometimes be stigma within families of talking about sex. And I would much rather kids be accessing these stories, these considerations, these topics through books than internet, which is so easy for our kids to access these days. Is that your experience?
That is my experience, and I completely agree. You know, we want every single teen to have parents they can go to and ask questions, but so many of us didn't have that. And so finding other opportunities to learn in a healthy way is important. And again, if there aren't books, teens are going to go to the internet, and the internet is not a good source of information. I do not want our teens to get information about what sexual relationships look like from Reddit or, God forbid, porn, actual
Amen.
porn that they can find,
Amen.
and not in our libraries.
Are there academic implications? You reference AP testing, but any other academic applications that could impact older students if they don't have access to a wide range of books?
Yeah, one of the things I'm concerned about is that this may lead to some libraries functionally not allowing books to be checked out from the adult section for teens across the board. And I know by the time I was 15 or 16, I never read YA. I went from kids' books to adult books. And this means teens couldn't check out Brave New World. They couldn't check out Beloved. They couldn't check out any number of great books that are part of how we become avid readers and are part of how they become prepared for college. Reading those novels is one of the number one things that helps prepare our students to be successful academically. And libraries may have to functionally not allow teens who don't have that parental check off from being able to access those books, regardless of the sexual content in them.
We had a conversation in the Public Education Committee with Commissioner Morath about the problem we have today in education where fewer and fewer kids are reading full books and are reading a lot fewer full novels and books than they used to. And instead, there is more focus on short passage reading. Limiting access when kids are already not reading enough books and the harm it does to attention span and to and the ability to concentrate and make your way through an entire book. We're seeing it already in academic results in the state and in this country. And so I appreciate your concern for making sure we're not further limiting access and reading opportunities for our young students.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I really thank you for bringing in that perspective, and you're absolutely right. Kids and teens are reading fewer books, and that's not good, that's not desirable. And you know, part of the reason for this amendment, if you're 12 or younger, you probably can't get to the library by yourself very often. So if you're there, your parent is probably there with you. They are probably able to sign off on what you want to check out. But if you're a teenager, you might walk over there after school. You might be driving. And the kids who we certainly want to be reading, certainly want to be successful, are the kids who don't have parents who are engaged enough to come sign off on them being able to check out books. And so without this amendment, we may have 17-year-olds who are stuck with picture books and Amelia Bedelia, which are not going to speak to their lives and are not going to engage them in being readers.
The gentlelady's time has expired.
I move adoption.
The chair recognizes Mr. Alders to speak in opposition to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, while I appreciate Representative Zwiener's intention here, I would argue that it does not comply with the goal of this legislation, and we need to protect our kids across the board, and that's the reason why we use the definition of a minor. And so I would respectfully ask that you join me in opposing this amendment.
Chair recognizes Ms. Johnson to speak in favor of the amendment.
So, as said earlier, I have had a chance to meet with victims of sexual exploitation, human trafficking, all the rest, kids that get abused in their early teens, the average age of introduction into human trafficking is 12 or 13. And let me tell you, we are frustrated as a society. The over-sexualization of children is a problem, but it ain't happening in your public libraries. It's happening on social media, it's happening in other contexts, and what is a public library? A public library is the promise that we made as a society when Chairman Van Dever this morning talked about his mother and her access to making it because of education. That's all a public library is. It is a place of education. It is a healthy place of education. And for all these parents that always say, I don't want my kid to get access to this information, I promise you, they are getting access to the information, and the ones you should not be afraid of are the books that are in your public library. I appreciate this amendment because it takes us from this ridiculousness of 18, at least down to 13. Think about the definitions he put in here. Some of you cringed and got red, and I swear to God, I feel like I'm in an episode of the old movie Footloose. Pretending that this doesn't happen or that these kids are not being confronted by this stuff is absolutely asinine. So be honest with them about society in a public and give them access to honest information, which comes out of a public library. So accept the amendment, drop this to 13, and start being rational, and remember what kind of information you needed to look at when you were a teenager.
Chair recognizes Mr. Money to speak against the amendment.
Mr. Speaker, members, neither this bill nor this amendment has anything to do with what kids can or cannot or should not look at. It's about whether the parent should be the one to decide. So I may disagree with Representatives Weiner or Representative Johnson or any of you about when or at what age my children should be able to encounter this kind of material. That's fine. This amendment says that any child over 13 can access that kind of information without your consent, without my consent, without their parents' consent. That's what this is about. If either one of these ladies that spoke in favor of this amendment would like to show their child anything in the public library, they're welcome to do that. If they want to check it out and take it home, they're welcome to do that. But I don't want my child to be able to go to the library looking for books about mystery or classics or about big dump trucks and stumble across one of these books without my knowledge or consent and be able to check it out. That's what this is about. It's about parents. And we need to stick with the author and say that unless a parent checks it out...
Mr. Tinderholt, for what purpose?
The gentleman yield for question.
I will yield for questions.
Gentleman yields for questions.
Do you have kids?
I have 5 kids.
I have a 6 and an 8-year-old, and when we go to the library, it's a lot of fun for our family. Who do you think should be the deciding factor or person or group of people that decide whether your children see sexualized or pornographic material? Who should decide that?
Their mother and I.
So, like I said, I have a 6 and an 8-year-old, and they know the difference between boys and girls, but I'm really fortunate right now that they don't know they don't know anything about pornography. They don't know anything about that type of stuff because we manage them in the library, and I have serious concerns about the sexualization of children and what a lot of people are wanting to happen. A moment ago, she mentioned that there's nothing happening in the library. Are you aware of any events such as drag shows and things like that were happening in libraries?
Absolutely. I think it's naive or dishonest to say that there's nothing that happens or that is material in libraries that children should not be able to see.
And you know, it's proven that people that are introduced to sexual things such as this or pornography, that they're more likely to become addicted to pornography over time. Are you aware of that?
Absolutely.
And so I just wanted to come here, ask you a couple questions, tell you that I'm in support with you. I'm against this amendment. I think children get to join the military at 18. They can look at pornography at the age of 18, and parents decide before 18. Matter of fact, I joined the military. Are you aware that I joined the military at 17 and my mom had to sign the paperwork for me to join?
I was not aware of that.
I couldn't join the military unless my mom signed, but we're potentially wanting to allow children to see pornographic materials in a library. I think that's crazy. Would you agree with that?
I would, and once again, the things that are outlined in this bill, that the amendment would take from 18 down to 13, include things that I don't even want to read here in front of you in the categories. Certainly, I don't want my 13, 14, 15-year-olds stumbling across in the library without my knowledge and checking out without my consent. And there are parents that may disagree with that. There's different parenting philosophies, and I'm a big parents' rights guy. And if they want to buy those books on Amazon, if they want to go to the public library and check those out for their kids, I'm not saying that should be illegal, and Mr. Alders isn't saying that should be illegal. It's a question of when is a child old enough to manage those decisions on their own? I made a lot of decisions when I was 13, 14, 15, 16 that I wish my parents had to consent to first, and I would not have maybe made those same decisions. This is a way to make sure our taxpayer-funded libraries are not giving our children materials that their parents do not want them to have.
So I'm going to ask you a hard question because I know you don't want to talk about it here, but do you have the titles in front of you of anything that's in the library? Do you
titles of the books?
Yeah.
I don't have that pulled up right here.
So are you aware that there's books that you hear them talk about that are maybe artistic, but are very graphic in sexual nature? Aren't those things that you might want when your children start learning about that stuff for them to come to you and mom and ask questions about versus going to a public library and seeing that stuff?
Sure, and we don't want to wait for them to ask questions. We talk about that with our kids all the time, but we want to be the ones to do it. We don't want them going on a scavenger hunt to find out for themselves without us knowing. And so that we monitor what they do at home on the computer, we monitor what they do at home on the TV, and we for sure would like the public library to be a safe space where we can say, if you're in the children's section, have at it, have fun, and I can be sure that they're not going to accidentally stumble on a graphic novel that depicts things that we would never let them look at home.
Do you think it's fair to say that the things that children see and hear shape them for the rest of their lives?
Absolutely.
So when they see pornographic material or they read very graphic pornographic material, how would you say that might shape them in their mid-teens all the way up through, say, 25 years old? What would you... Do you think it could potentially create deviant behavior or even criminal behavior at some point?
I'm not a psychologist, but I would say yes. I don't think that seeing that kind of material is beneficial in any way, especially for a child. And there may be people here that disagree with me. That's fine. They can do what they would like to with their own children. But our taxpayer-funded libraries should not be circumventing parents to ensure that children have access to this kind of material without their parents' consent.
Well, I agree with you. It's the parent's choice on when and how that happens, and I don't think that we should have this stuff in libraries, so I agree with you. We shouldn't move it down to 13 either, so thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Morgan, for what purpose?
Does the gentleman yield for questions?
I will yield for questions.
Gentleman yields for questions.
So this amendment is just, the opposing of this amendment is saying, look, until they're 18, are you still responsible for your kids at home?
I absolutely am.
Right. And so they're under your guidance and your leadership, and you are responsible for everything, putting clothes on their back, food on the table, etc. for them, correct?
Yes, I am.
And that's also, you're responsible for their education, correct?
Yes, their physical, moral, spiritual, emotional, mental development. That is what a parent does. A parent helps to guide a child to adulthood. And the parent does that according to their own sense of what is best for that child.
Right. And so by keeping the age at 18, You're not saying that if you're the parent that you can't still go look and see and show that information to them, check out the books or whatever. It's that you have a right to help in that decision making of what they have access to. Is that correct?
That is correct. And as I have said, and will say again, there are people in this body and people outside this building who will make different decisions for what is right for their children than I would make. And this bill doesn't say that they're not allowed to do that. It just says that until they're 18, we're going to let the parent or guardian decide how to manage access to those materials. We're not going to put these materials in a place in the library that children might stumble onto or seek out without their parents' knowledge and consent.
Right. Just like when you go to a movie, if you go see an R-rated movie, to buy the ticket, you gotta, and walk into that theater, they're gonna check to make sure. Is that correct?
That's right. And I have, I have shown my kids at different ages movies that are outside their age range, and said, hey, I think I've previewed this movie. I think this movie is fine, even if you're not yet 13 or even if you're not yet 17. And I'm going to work through this with you and talk with you. Or, hey, I'm going to let you watch that at a friend's house. But it's still my choice what they are watching and what they are being subject to. And as they show that they're responsible and they're making wise decisions, I may free that up a little bit and let them do more. But I'm going to do that based on where I think that kid is mentally, emotionally, spiritually, physically. Are they ready to encounter that kind of material? But that is my responsibility as a parent to make sure.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you.
Chair recognizes Ms. Weiner.
Mr. Speaker,
Ms. Johnson, for what purpose?
will the gentleman yield for questions, and will you grant an extension of time?
Gentlemen, are you requesting
I'm asking an extension of time.
There is an objection. This will be a division vote on the extension of time. Vote aye, vote no. Strike the board. Strike the board. The gentleman's time is not extended. Chair recognizes Ms. Weiner to close on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I want to take a moment to just address some of the things that were brought up on this amendment that just aren't accurate to how it would work. First of all, I wholeheartedly agree that you should have to be 18 in order to access pornography. That is not what this amendment is addressing. That is not what this bill is addressing. The definition of what is considered obscene for minors is done under the Miller test, a modified version of it for minors, which has 3 prongs. The first one is that the material appeals to a prurient interest. The second is that it is patently offensive in a way that is agreed to by the prevailing community standards. And the third prong is that the material has no other value for minors. Members, the literature affected by this bill is far broader than that. And it includes classics that many of us here have enjoyed without question. It includes books that get taught in our high school English classes and books that help our teens learn about the world. The second thing, members, is this amendment is not about little kids. This amendment is about teenagers. And teenagers and little kids have different needs. And I want our teenagers, including our teenagers with crappy parents who won't sign a stinking permission slip, to be able to check out books at the library. I don't want our teenagers to be functionally limited to the books that pass muster under this test. I don't want our teenagers to be stuck with books like Goosebumps and Roald Dahl. As wonderful as those authors are, they are not authors that end up engaging 15, 16, 17-year-olds. So what this amendment seeks to do is give our teens access to age-appropriate material. And members, this has been alluded to a lot, but I do want to bring up this element that I think is really important. Being a minor does not protect children and teens from sexual assault. And it is fairly common with teens. And many of y'all know that I personally was sexually assaulted when I was 17. And the reason I bring that up is because when I was sexually assaulted at 17, I did not have the word rape for that experience. I took that situation upon myself, and I thought it was my fault. I thought I had made a mistake, and even had trouble recognizing that I was in a situation where I had no ability to get out of it. The right book might have helped me figure out that I didn't make a mistake, that somebody wronged me much earlier. And I was also a teenager when I read a book that literally is how I learned about the idea of being roofied. Some of these books that deal with these teenage situations, not adult situations, teenage situations, help keep our teenagers safe. One of the most frequently challenged books we see is Perks of Being a Wallflower. And the scene that everyone reads from it and brings up as an issue is a scene where a teenage boy is forcing a teenage girl to perform oral sex on him. And you're seeing the scene through the eyes of a younger teen boy seeing it happen at a party. And it's the experience of him figuring out he's seeing something happen that is wrong. Members, that's a scene that encourages our teenagers to intervene if they see sexual assault occurring. It is a scene that encourages our teenagers to be mindful of consent when they're in situations with each other. And it's a scene that helps victims of sexual assault understand it's not their fault. And our teenagers should have access to books that help them learn those lessons, regardless of whether or not their parents are willing to sign a permission slip.
Mr. Tallarico, for what purpose?
Mr. Speaker, does the gentlelady yield?
Will the lady yield for questions?
I do.
The lady yields.
Thank you, Representative Zwiener. Just because the term pornography was thrown around, it is already illegal to share pornography with a minor. Is that correct?
Absolutely. That's the harmful materials statute, section 43.24 of the Penal Code.
And so if you find pornography in a library, whether it's a public library or school library, you shouldn't call the librarian, you shouldn't call your state rep, you should call the police. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Members, I urge you to vote yes on this amendment.
Ms. Weiner sends up an amendment. The amendment is not acceptable to the author. A record vote has been requested. The clerk will ring the bell. Show Mr. Alders voting nay. Show Mr. Buckley voting nay. Show Ms. Gonzalez of Harris voting aye. Have all voted. There being 58 ayes, 86 nays, the amendment fails to adopt. Dr. Buckley for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that the House grant permission for the Committee on Public Education to meet while the House is in session today at 5:30 p.m. in room 1W14, the Ag Museum, to consider pending, referred, and committee business.
Members, you've heard the motion. Is there objection? The chair hears none, so ordered. The following announcement, the clerk will read the announcement.
The Committee on Public Education will meet today at 5:30 p.m. in room 1W.14, Agriculture Museum, in a formal meeting to consider pending, referred, and committee business.
The following amendment, the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment by Morales-Shaw.
Chair recognizes Ms. Morales-Shaw to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Rep. Alders, you and I are both parents. I appreciate the intent of your bill on the face of the bill. And like you, I want my kids to, and I want all kids to read kids' books. This amendment, my amendment, simply makes crystal clear and ensures that the review process of public library materials available to youth is free from discrimination and that books are solely vetted by the content that's age appropriate and not based on constitutionally protected statuses, and therefore it should be acceptable to the author. The amendment simply makes safeguards against misclassification of books.
Mr. Speaker,
Ms. Morales, for what purpose?
will the gentlelady yield for
Will the
some
lady yield
questions?
for questions?
Yes,
The lady
I will.
yields.
Thank you so much, Representative Morales-Shaw, for this amendment. I appreciate it because in Texas, 29% of the population live in Spanish-speaking households, including families in our districts. So it's common for Latino children to grow up speaking Spanish or in bilingual homes. So how does this amendment safeguard culturally relevant material that uses our language or explores our faith, family, or heritage from being deemed inappropriate?
Thank you for the question, Representative Morales. I'm sure that Representative Alders and other representatives are not trying to exclude the 29% that you mentioned from having culturally rich materials in their library that they can relate to. And this amendment simply makes sure that library materials aren't misclassified or removed from libraries inappropriately based on the constitutionally protected rights, one of them which includes ethnicity.
So can you speak to how this amendment ensures that public libraries remain inclusive and welcoming spaces for Latino youth rather than pushing us further into invisibility under the guise of protecting minors?
Yeah, well, yeah, sure. I mean, anyone, whether it's a Latino or any person from any cultural background, should be able to go into a library and find books that they're familiar with, that speak to their background, that encourage and support their upbringing, the way that they're brought up due to their parents or their nation of origin, all of those things. And so everyone should have that comfort and knowing that there's a wide selection of books in a library that can appeal to all backgrounds.
I agree with you. And isn't it true that banning books because of the identity of the author, like a Latino immigrant, for example, sends a message to our youth that their stories or voices are somehow shameful or dangerous?
It can, yeah, it certainly can. And there was an analysis of book screening data from PEN America that was done back in 2022, and it found that a lot of the materials that were removed were wrongfully misclassified, and they were removed based on a person's background, and generally that was from a minority group.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your amendment because books like The House on Mango Street, Aristotle, and Dante could be banned just because they tell the truth about who we are, and your amendment will protect this. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Move passage. Adopt.
Mr. Alders, in opposition to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate Representative Morales-Shaw for bringing this, but the goal of this bill is to discriminate based on the sexually explicit content of books in libraries. There is no other discrimination, and so I would argue that this is not germane even to the point of the bill, and I would ask you to join me in opposition.
Ms. Morales-Shaw to close on the amendment.
Libraries are for everyone. Let's keep it that way. Move adoption.
Ms. Morales-Shaw sends up an amendment. The amendment is not acceptable to the author. A record vote has been requested. The clerk will ring the bell. Show Mr. Alders voting nay. Show Ms. Garcia of Bear voting aye. Show Ms. Gonzalez of Harris voting aye. Of Dallas have all voted. There being 55 ayes, 85 nays, the amendment fails to adopt. The following amendment, the clerk will read the amendment. Mr. Morales, for what purpose?
Mr. Speaker, Morales of Maverick would like to move to have the comments from Morales of Harris and the other Morales of Harris reduced to writing and put on the journal, please.
Members, you've heard the motion. Is there objection? The chair hears none, so ordered. Following amendment, the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment by Garcia of Bear.
The chair recognizes Ms. Garcia of Bear to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, This amendment ensures that the review process for screening sexually explicit content does not target an author or character's political views or First Amendment free speech rights. This amendment helps to meet the bill author's intent to only capture those materials which are deemed sexually explicit. When guidance on censorship laws are written in a manner that is overly broad, they risk being weaponized to suppress the voices of certain groups, often in ways never intended by the guidance, such as restrictions on materials discussing protest movements, individual rights, or injustice. The ALA reported in 2022 that Texas challenged more book titles than any other state, 17% of which were pushed by political or religious groups. The ALA reported in 2024 that 72% of the books challenged in schools and public libraries were pushed by organized movements. Public libraries are places for students to think critically, ask questions, engage with the world around them. They should have access to books that reflect the range of political and social conversations happening in our state and around the world. This amendment is a basic protection, balancing free expression and the author's goal of mitigating exposure to sexually explicit content, and this should be acceptable by the author.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Tallarico, for what purpose?
Does the gentlelady yield for some
The lady
questions?
yield for questions.
I do.
The lady yields.
Thank you, Representative Garcia. So I just want to understand, so the bill requires that libraries adopt a process to review specific material in its collections upon petition from a member of the public and determine if the material contains sexually explicit material not later than the 10th day after the date of the receipt of the petition. That's correct. That's what's in the bill.
Yes, sir.
And then your amendment is just adding language after that that just says that it ensures that the process described in that subdivision does not result in the designation of a library material as sexually explicit material because of viewpoint discrimination or other discrimination against the political, ideological, moral, ethical, or other worldviews of the characters or the author. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
So isn't there a risk that without this common sense amendment, libraries could remove books based on political pressure rather than actual content?
Absolutely, Representative Tallarico. As I mentioned, studies showed just from 2024 that 72% of the books that were reviewed in Texas libraries were based on political views. And what we really just want to make sure is not happening here is that this isn't kind of a smokescreen under the guise to further criminalize us for free speech.
Yeah, because I'm remembering our former colleague, Representative Matt Krause, came out with a list of books, and many of the books on that list were not necessarily sexually explicit, but were left-leaning in their political viewpoint. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely, yes, it is.
And I remember specifically, and I worry, especially with this bill, that some of these books about pregnancy or the issue of abortion in particular could be swept up in these removals.
Yes.
Is that also a concern you share?
Absolutely, yes, it is.
So at least 11 of the books on that list focused on the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court ruling. There was also John Irving's The Cider House Rules, whose main characters include a doctor who performs abortions. It was included on that list.
Yes.
And there are also, these are bills that maybe come from a pro-choice perspective. There are also pro-life books. I'm thinking of A Spark of Light by Jodi Picoult, Unexpected Choice by Dr. Patricia Guybink. So if we don't adopt your amendment, there could be a risk that books with particularly political viewpoints on either side of the aisle could be removed from certain shelves.
Yes, Representative Tallarico, and I think a lot of times when we're having these conversations, we kind of get pitted into these very hyper-politicalized separations, but really what this is stating is that it impacts all of us, whether we are progressive, conservative, or liberal.
Why is it important to protect political expression in books available to minors?
Well, because that's how children are able to kind of develop their political views is by socializing and being involved with those types of things. And although we do have a lot of colleagues here who have grown up in the political realm, there's a lot of our children who aren't aware of what civic engagement really means.
You know, and I think about how most kids get their initial political views from their parents, whether those parents are conservative or whether those parents are progressive. And the way that you can start to develop your own political views or ideological views is by reading widely, reading authors from all different types of perspectives. Is that fair to say?
That is very fair to say, and I would also like to also share a little tidbit of information. You know, it's no surprise and no secret that I'm the only woman veteran that has ever served in this body, and I represent Military City, USA. Military City, USA and our families, we are nonpartisan. Military members, they don't practice conservatism, they don't practice politically because they're mission focused and they follow the commands and the orders of the Commander-in-Chief to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. So in my community, in Bexar County, San Antonio, there are not a whole lot of children who have had a robust political experience with their parents because we come from military backgrounds. So having access to these books is definitely something that is critical in shaping their political foresight. A lot of them are going to be first-time voters in San Antonio and Bexar County because, as you know, as us military members move around, a lot of times where we end up is not where we originated, and so we're kind of late in the power curve getting involved in local elections.
You brought up the Constitution. Does this amendment to this bill protect the First Amendment right to freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of association, where the bill without this amendment would not?
Yes, it does. And as a woman who has served in conflict overseas, I take protecting our freedoms very seriously. And I hope that this amendment would be acceptable to the author.
Would you agree that presenting only one political point of view in public libraries would be doing a disservice to Texans?
Absolutely. It does not allow, and I know we say children a lot because we are focusing on children and expanding their foresight and expanding their knowledge, but we also have to worry about also young adults. Young adults are often too not involved in a lot of social justice issues and daily life issues outside of what they currently experience. And so this is another way that we can help them as well.
And this protects all of us, right? We
Yes.
don't want progressive communities, say here in Travis County, using this process to get rid of conservative books. We also don't want conservative communities using this process to get rid of progressive books. We want to make sure that all viewpoints are protected and available to young people who are trying to figure out their own political views. Is that correct?
Absolutely. The United States is the freest country in the world, and having the freedom of choice for your political opinions and your political theology is very critical.
Is it fair to say that this amendment that you're offering protects us against cancel culture?
Yes, it does.
We don't want any kind of political perspective to be canceled in our public libraries. Is that
No,
correct?
we don't.
How would these changes improve the overall bill, in your opinion?
Well, it improves the overall bill by ensuring that we stay laser beam focused on what the intent is. And what the intent of this bill is to make sure that minors don't have access to sexually explicit material, and we want to ensure that it remains focused on sexually explicit material.
And as we already established, there have been incidents in the past where that sexually explicit term was used to go after certain books with a certain political perspective, rather than going after the actual, sexually explicit material. Is that right?
Yes, actually, in 2022, Granbury ISD and Lake Travis ISD actually had the book Out of Darkness by Ashley Hope Perez removed, and it had some historical themes as well as some mature themes. So,
Ladies, time has expired. Chair recognizes Mr. Alders in opposition to the amendment.
Thank you, Ms. Garcia, for bringing this amendment. But the bill is not a political bill. This is a bill about protecting Texas kids. Our definition is clear. Please join me in voting no.
Ms. Garcia to close on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I would probably
Mr.
venture.
Speaker?
Ms. Weiner, for what purpose?
Will the gentlelady yield for a couple questions?
Will the lady yield for questions?
I do.
The lady yields.
Thank you so much, Representative Garcia. I listened to you and Representative Tallarico talk about several books that had experienced bans, potentially for political reasons.
Yes.
I wanted to ask, have you ever heard of Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand being
have.
banned? Have
I
you
have.
heard of it being banned?
I can't advise at this point in time.
Well, I am fully unaware of somebody ever challenging Atlas Shrugged for having sexual content. Are you aware of the political leanings of that author and her work?
Unfortunately, I'm not advised.
Ayn Rand is a libertarian author, actually one of the founders of the libertarian political philosophies. Would it surprise you for me to tell you that despite us never hearing about her work being banned for sexual content, that her work has several sex scenes in them that would meet the test of this bill?
I'm actually not surprised, and that's why I brought the amendment forward, just to make sure that we stay laser beam focused on what the intent was.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for bringing this great amendment.
Thank you, Rep. Zwiener. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Public libraries are a sacred institution in my community. They increase literacy, promote access to resources, and bring people together in their pursuit of knowledge and betterment. I would even venture to say, members, I probably have more children than anybody in this body. I have 8 children, and I go above and beyond to ensure that my children are protected. There's a lot of scary things in this world, but I've never been terrified to send my children to a public library. And stories have power to broaden perspective. And it's so important for us to let people hear about experiences and views that differ from their own. Matter of fact, a lot of you have heard stories from me that are views that have differed from your own, experiences that have differed from your own, that you know you've actually learned some things. However, as written, House Bill 3225 creates a broad opportunity to ban books without the necessary protections.
Mr. Speaker.
Members, there's a long history of weaponizing books. There's a long history of using books as objects of obscenity in order to silence us and silence voices that differ from the agendas that are in power. And through the threat of civil lawsuits from the Attorney General and a loss of funding, this bill will further incentivize libraries to overreach out of fear of retribution from the state. This amendment would create common sense guardrails on this bill to ensure that taxpayer-funded libraries are not making decisions to ban books based on political or world views of an author or the character of a book. Since anyone from anywhere can weaponize the review process created by this bill, this amendment will ensure that it will not be used to restrict access to diverse views and experiences unnecessarily. This is an amendment of integrity. I move adoption.
Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Reynolds, for what purpose?
would the gentlelady yield for a question?
I do.
Gentlelady yields for question.
Thank you, Representative Garcia. I don't want to be redundant, and I think you've pretty much hit on what your amendment does and the reason why you're bringing this amendment. Would you agree with me that we live in a very hyper-political environment where book bans have been basically taken a real political lens? Would you agree with that?
I would definitely agree with that, Representative Reynolds. As I mentioned earlier, in 2022, all book reviews, there was 17% of books that were reviewed. Today, 2024 was 2025, but 2024, 70% of books.
And quite simply, you're trying to take politics out of libraries, correct?
Absolutely.
You're not trying to put your thumb on the scale for Democrats, Republicans, independents, libertarians. You said we need to take politics out of books. Is that what your amendment does?
Yes, it does.
And we have seen partisan politics come into critical race theory conversations, correct?
Yes.
Where we don't want certain subjects to be taught, correct?
Yes, we experienced that heavy last session.
And so what your amendment is doing is saying, hey, we don't want to have people on the left, the right, the center, anywhere having any influence from what our children can learn in libraries, correct?
That is correct.
Libraries should be a beacon of light so that intellectual curiosity, so that children can learn from whatever kind of book it is, correct?
That is correct.
And your amendment would ensure that protection, correct?
That is true.
And as in the conversation with Representative Talarico, we don't want to have for example, your district may be more Democratic leaning, and someone else's district in another area of Texas, we have 254 counties, may be more conservative leaning. But we want to have a level playing field regardless of where the library is located in Texas, correct?
Yes, we need a fair and balanced, equitable depiction of knowledge.
Well, Representative Garcia, I think you have a great amendment. Thank you for bringing it.
Thank you, Representative.
Partisan politics should not be in our libraries. Thank you.
Thank you, Rep. Reynolds. I move passage. I move adoption.
Please excuse Representatives J. Lopez, Hunter, Gerdes, Harris, Leach, A. Johnson, and Hernandez to attend a meeting of the Committee on Calendars on the motion of Mr. Guerin. Is there any objection? Chair hears none. So ordered. Okay. Yeah. Ms. Garcia of Bear sends up an amendment. The amendment is not acceptable to the author. Question occurs on the adoption of the amendment. Those in favor vote aye. Those opposed vote nay. The clerk will ring the bell. Show Mr. Alders voting nay. Have all members voted? Have all members voted? There being 50 ayes and 77 nays, the amendment fails to adopt. The following amendment, the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment by Dutton.
Chair recognizes Mr. Dutton to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, if you looked at the amendment that I have here, before I had this when I had a handwritten amendment. And so now I've had these people over here do it so that it's not handwritten. And you might wonder, well, what does that have to do with this? And let me tell you what it has to do with it. The same outcome is with my handwritten amendment versus this one. You get the same outcome. And the whole point about this bill is to restrict access to this kind of material to young kids. And if that's what the options are, if that's what the bill is designed to do, what my amendment does that. And it does it without all the violence that's created by the other amendment. First of all, let me ask you this. The bill supposes that there's a $10,000 fine for a child who gets certain material. Well, I assume that's a $10,000 fine against the librarian. But who's going to do that? I mean, is the Attorney General going to have a section called Library Police so that they go around to all the public libraries all over Texas and try to prosecute it? No, he's not going to do that. And it's not even going to be on his list of things to do, because there are far more important things than the Attorney General's office than there is to fool around with libraries. And so this amendment accomplishes what I think the author is trying to do, because what it does is it sets up a restricted area in the library for all of this material, so that the only way you will have access to it is you either have to be an adult or have your parental or guardian's permission to go in there. That's what this ought to do. That's what this ought to be. And I don't think we ought to be creating civil penalties for anybody or having people pay money. And that's not the point of this bill. And so if that's not the point of it, let's don't do it. And I'll be happy to answer any questions, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Anchia, for what purpose?
Mr. Speaker, will Chairman Dutton yield for some questions?
I yield.
The gentleman yields.
On his brilliant amendment.
I yield on my brilliant amendment.
Chairman Dutton, how'd you do what we've been spending hours trying to do in just like 10 minutes writing this bill?
It's, you know...
Isn't it just common sense?
Well, that's what it is. And I think most of the people in there have common sense. And I think they're smart. And they're able to figure out how to achieve an objective without causing the whole world to fall down.
And your definition actually makes more sense because it's just not sexually explicit material. It's any material harmful to kids.
Yeah, exactly.
And you want to protect kids, don't you?
Absolutely. And that's what this amendment does. And it does it in a way that is exactly the same as the bill.
And it doesn't pull more money out of libraries. Our libraries are starving anyway. How are they going to be paying these $10,000 fines when somebody gets grumpy about a book in the library?
And it reduces state costs because now the state doesn't have to engage in certain behavior.
Right. And you don't put it in the hands exclusively of the Attorney General.
No.
Right?
No.
You say, hey.
He's got better things to do.
Right. He can't even collect child support these days.
Well, I didn't want to say that, but yeah, I mean, but you're right. There are things that we want the Attorney General to do, and I don't think he needs to have a library police protection group in his department.
Genius amendment. I appreciate it. I will be supporting it because I share your concern about protecting children from all kinds of harmful materials, and we can do it far more simply than this bill contemplates.
That's exactly right. Thank you, Mr. Anchia.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Schoolcraft, for what purpose?
Will the gentleman yield for a
I
question?
yield, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman yields.
Mr. Dutton, can you tell me what you mean when you say it's not accessible to children? Does it have to be a separate room?
No, it doesn't have to be just has to be inaccessible. And what inaccessible can mean is it could be roped off so that nobody can go in there without the librarian knowing that that's an adult or a child who comes up with a permission slip from their parent or guardian.
Okay. I'm thinking about small city municipal libraries. You know,
right.
Dallas, San Antonio, Houston, those libraries have lots and lots of space. They can set off a separate room. They can segregate it in a way that makes it easy to police. Little places like Marion, Texas, Schertz, Cibolo, those places have libraries. They're not staffed the way these big municipal ones are. They don't have the space for it. They're going to have a hard time complying with the bill as it is. Now, if you make them create another space that's segregated and policed, I'm just saying I don't think it's going to work for those smaller areas that don't have the resources that you're thinking of.
Well, I'm not sure that's true. I think that all libraries are set up so that they have books in a certain section. They don't have them all jumbled up together. And what they could do is create just a section that is inaccessible without the librarian's permission.
But they're small. They're single rooms. They're not easily, can't even rope them off because sometimes they're just large rectangular rooms with desks in the middle.
Well, most of those places probably don't have the books we're talking about.
Why would that be?
Well, because they have more cows than people.
Ah, They just have different values.
Yes.
Okay.
Right.
Anyway, I'm just saying, I understand what you're trying to do. I think it would be great for the big cities, but I think it's going to be very, very difficult for the small cities, the small municipal libraries to comply with.
Well,
That's it.
if you think that, you ought to be concerned about the bill rather than amendment, because what's going to happen is if there is no way to police it at all, how are they ever going to know if somebody checked out or went to view a book that had all the bad material you don't want in it? You don't want the children to see.
I'm not saying they can't police it. I'm just saying the way your bill is written, they are responsible for having a separate area that's policed, and they can. I would like to give them the flexibility to figure out the best way that they can go about complying with this requirement. That's it.
And one of the ways, Ms. Schoolcraft, I believe they will tell you, is that librarians can figure out how to make this work, because all they would be required to do would be to have a section that includes all this harmful material. If they're a small library, they're gonna, I don't assume they'll have most of this material in there. So you're talking about trying to restrict an area that may have 10 to 12 books in it. And I don't see how that would be a problem at all. I mean, they wouldn't have like 5,000 books.
They've already got an adult section. They've already got it segregated out. It's you know, you're just requiring an additional burden on them.
Well, no, I'm just requiring.
And if they don't have the room and they don't have the resources to do it, it's not going to work the way it will in Dallas.
Well, it seems that they could just rope off the section. They wouldn't have to have a separate room, because, and they may just have, in the libraries you mentioned, they may just have one shelf that has these books on it.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Rosenthal, for what purpose?
Would the gentleman yield for a couple of questions?
I yield, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman yields.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Chairman Dutton. I want to follow up on the line of questioning that that Mr. Schoolcraft was just asking. So I think it's just let's use our imagination. What are we going to do in a small space to have an area that's inaccessible to the minors, right?
Well, yeah, I don't.
Let me ask the question. Let me ask it like this.
Sure.
If you got a small little place, let's say it's like a convenience store. Now, at a convenience store, they sell some things that are harmful to minors, like cigarettes.
Correct.
They have to have the cigarettes in a place that's inaccessible to minors, right? Why can't we just have the books on a shelf behind the librarian? Would that be possible?
Well, you raise an interesting point. I just think that librarians can make this work. There's not rocket science as to how to. And if it's a small library like what Mr. Schoolcraft was talking about, I don't see where they're going to have a whole bunch of books that fit this.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, Ms. I move adoption of the amendment.
Chair recognizes Mr. Alders to speak in opposition to the amendment.
Thank you, Chairman Dutton, for bringing this, but I'm going to oppose. In all fairness, your amendment is more restrictive than my bill. Please join me in voting no.
Question, Mr. Dutton sends up. Chair recognizes Mr. Dutton to close on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members. Again, if you'll read the amendment, it just says that each library shall ensure that the restricted section may only be accessed by adults or children under 18 years of age with permission of a parent or guardian. I don't know how that does violence to what the objective of the author of the bill has. It seems to me that it accomplishes what he wants to do without inventing lawsuits or without inventing all of this $10,000 civil penalties for librarians. You know, we have a shortage of librarians now. So a librarian's going to have to get librarian liability insurance? I mean, is that what's going to happen? I don't think that's what we ought to do. Because what the author's bill does, it creates a department in the AG's office for librarian police Then in addition to that, it creates an opportunity for librarians now to go out and purchase liability insurance. I mean, all of that's crazy. This body is certainly smarter than what's being pretended by this bill. We can do this, and we should do this, and I know that some of this is sort of the red meat for elections, and I got it. But even then, even that ought to be done with some caution when we're talking about imposing civil penalties on librarians. I mean, you know, children sometimes do things simply because they're children. And we shouldn't make that conduct so bad that even adults end up paying for it. And sometimes if the child gets a book, that just seems to me something we would rather have than a child getting a gun. And yet we don't penalize anybody $10,000 for a child getting a gun, but we want to penalize people for a child getting a book. And charging them $10,000 just seems to me to be crazy. And so, Mr. Speaker and members, I move adoption of the amendment.
Mr. Dutton sends up an amendment. The amendment is not acceptable to the author. This is a record vote has been requested. All those in favor vote aye. All those opposed vote nay. The clerk will ring the bell. Show Mr. Alders voting nay. Show Mr. Versuit voting nay. Show Mr. Dutton voting aye. Show Mr. Raymond voting nay. Have all members voted? Show Ms. Davis of Dallas, Y. Davis of Dallas voting aye. Show Mr. Reynolds voting aye. Show Ms. Jones of Harris voting aye. Have all members voted? Have all members voted? There being 56 ayes and 81 nays, the amendment fails. Is there anyone who wishes to speak on, for, or against the bill? Seeing none, the chair recognizes Mr. Alders to close on the bill.
Move passage.
Question occurs on passage to engrossment of HB 3225. A record vote has been requested. The clerk will ring the bell. Show Mr. Alders voting aye. Show Ms. Leo Wilson voting aye. Have all members voted? Have all members voted? There being 82 ayes and 53 nays, HB 3225 is passed to engrossment.